Hi everyone, I'm here today with my friend Chris. We have a video for you today that will focus on how to become a chief executive. We have 7 tips to share with you, and I would like to introduce Chris to you as well as my friend.
I'm a chief executive of a small agency, which is my agency, consultancy that I run. But previously I was a chief executive of bigger organisations, so I guess we're up to 1,800 people. Friend of Sanya's.
So Chris and I have known each other for a couple of years now.
Yep.
Chris's daughter Esme goes to the same school with my son Alexander. That's how we know each other. In my conversations with Chris, I've learned he used to be chief executive. He had a very interesting career journey, and I really wanted to invite Chris to share his story because I personally have always wondered, how do people even become chief executives? I often find that journey is not well reported, or people don't often share how you become one. There is this view that you have to go to a business school and do MBAs and things like that, whereas Chris's journey is slightly different. So if I hand over to Chris to introduce himself and his journey with some sort of a timeline as to how it all started, and then we will go through certain tips as to how he behaved, what he did to be spotted as talent and the chief executive.
Okay, cool. So I currently run my own consulting business called Purpose-Led Performance, and I've been doing that for the last 3 years. But before that, I worked as a chief executive for about 6 years, and then before that in senior executive positions. As Sanya said, my journey wasn't particularly traditional. I didn't go to business school. I never had ambitions to be a chief executive. So if I tell you a little bit about my story and my journey, so I'm actually going to go back to when I was 18 to begin with, because when I was 18, I was at sixth form college in the UK. I was supposed to be revising for my exams, and I was in the library, and I picked up a book in the library about Buddhism, and I read it, and I thought, oh, I think I might be Buddhist. So what I decided to do is I decided to go to India for a year, and I went to live in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery to learn about Buddhism. Turns out Tibetan Buddhist monastery is not a great place to learn about Buddhism when you're 18, but I did pick up a phrase when I was there that a friend told me, and the phrase was, the meaning of life is to be happy and useful. And so I came back to the UK, I went to university, and that was my mantra. I want to be happy and useful. And so when other people were in the careers library looking up all the progression opportunities, I didn't really ever go in. I went in the careers library once, and I thought, oh, this looks like hard work. And so after university, I went to Japan for a couple of years. I did like a teaching program, and I traveled around Asia. And so I came back to the UK about age 25, and I thought, right, I best get a proper grown-up job. But in my head, my mantra was I want to be happy and useful. So I wanted to find a job that I was going to be happy and useful. So the job I found was to be an employment advisor, helping long-term unemployed people back into work. And so that's how I started. No ambition to be a CEO, and most people would kind of think that's not how you become a CEO, by doing a frontline public service role. 6.5 years later, I became deputy CEO. And so when I joined that business, it had grown from, when I joined, it was 40 people, and over the next 6.5 years, it grew to 500 people, and I became deputy CEO. A couple of years after that, I was sat around the boardroom table with the world's highest paid accountant, who was the chair of the board, a guy called John Connolly. He was the managing partner at Deloitte, and I remember reading an article about John Connolly being the world's highest paid accountant. And the deputy chair was the First Lady of Australia.
Yes.
A lady called Therese Rain, who actually had owned the business originally, set up the business, grew it, great person, and then Deloitte bought 50% of the business. And it's just a very strange beginning from being an unemployment advisor to sitting around the boardroom table. And then from there, I went to run the UK business for a large American corporate, and they're multi-billion-pound organisation, and I grew the UK business from 25 million to 170 million revenue. And then I did my first CEO role, and I did a couple of CEO roles, and then I got to where I am now, where I in my consultancy, I work with businesses and I work with business leaders on their performance, their growth, and also on sustainability.
Fantastic. It's a fantastic story. Definitely feel free to connect to Chris on LinkedIn. There is a new YouTube channel. When Chris and I talked about this idea, we thought about sharing 7 tips that clearly worked for Chris, that are easy to understand, easy to action, easy to work with. So if we start with tip number 1, Chris. First tip, when Chris and I talked about this, by the way, this is not scripted at all, so we're just having a go at having this conversation recorded. First tip, when you and I talked about, you wanted to mention finding your passion through your organization. So
Yep.
what do you mean by this?
Do something that you're passionate about. And that first role that I did, unemployment advisor, I was getting to be happy and useful. So I was working with people, I was helping people. And the organization that I worked in was a great organization,
Yeah.
very purpose driven. It was a great environment. And so I was super passionate about it. And what happens when you're passionate about your work is it stops feeling like work. So when you find something that you're passionate about, then you naturally are motivated to get more involved,
Yeah.
to learn more about it, and to put more stuff in.
Tip number 2 is develop your own opinion.
Develop your own opinion, be curious. In that first organization, I obviously did my job, but I was really curious about what was going on. I went to visit other offices. What I would do as well is I would wonder about why we were doing the things that we were doing. I'd look at maybe things that the CEO was announcing, wonder why they were doing that. I would look at things that managers were doing, and I would have a critical opinion to it, not to criticize them, but I would be thinking, why are they doing that? Would I do it that way? Would I do it differently? What impact are they trying to have? Constantly thinking about the organization and the people in it. And through that started to develop my own view. What I've seen, and I've interviewed a lot of people for senior roles, and the mistake that people make is they think they're trying to guess the answer that you want them to make. Whereas the reality, when I've interviewed people for senior roles, I really want to know what they think.
So tip number 3 is the 80-20 rule.
Okay.
What do you mean by this?
So I guess there's lots of 80-20 rules. When I talk about the 80-20 rule, so one of the things that, again, I've witnessed in people who want to progress, there are some people who focus 100% being great at their job. So they go really deep on their job and they think that will automatically get them promoted to the next level. And the reality is being great at your own job is an important part of progressing in an organization. It's an important part to being recognized. By itself, that's not enough. And there's another point, we'll come on to that. At the other extreme, I saw people who they thought to get ahead, what they needed to do was do other things and get involved in loads of other projects. And so actually they'd spend 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% of the time getting involved in other projects, and often they wouldn't actually be good at the job that they were paid for because they were so interested at moving to the next job. And so the 80-20 rule for me is, if you want to progress, you need to be great at your own job and you need to be performing at it. And if you're not doing that, well, that's where you need to focus your time. But actually, once you get great at your own job, you want to try and be able to do your job brilliantly in 80% of the time that you've got. And then the other 20% of the time you use to volunteer to take on new responsibilities, new projects, get involved, be proactive. And that enables you to learn, build your reputation, build relationships, but also get recognized, continue to get recognized because you're doing the job you get paid for great. And so yeah, 80-20 rule, get great at your job, but then do other stuff as well.
Tip number 4 is don't see the title, see the person.
As you progress through your career, this is about how you engage with people in more senior roles. And what I have observed is people can get quite nervous. So when people meet the CEO or they meet the chairman of the board or whatever it is, or people who are more senior for them, they see the role and they get nervous, they don't act like themselves. And again, one of the things I think that stood me in great stead through my career is I just always engaged with the person. I always saw them as a person. I was respectful of them because of their position. However, I engaged with them on an individual level as a person. I was confident. I guess that's the key thing, is what you have to be confident when you engage with people who are in more senior roles. And if you look at the title, then often you're not confident. Often you're worried about how you might come across. But if you just see them as a person, it doesn't matter. And I remember that first organization, the chief executive, it was called Richard Johnson. We had debates. He really liked to get out there and meet people. And if I disagreed with him on something, I'd say it in a respectful way. But he respected me for that because I engaged with him on a level. And if you're somebody that wants to progress in your career, it's really important that people don't see you as somebody that's junior. They see you as somebody who's at their level.
Tip number 5 is what got you here won't get you there.
I think this is the title of a great book. It's a book by Marshall Goldsmith, who's a world-leading coach. But this is the point, and it relates to the 80-20 rule. Again, the mistake that people thing is things that made you successful in the role that you're doing now will be enough to make you successful in your future role. However, as you go into new roles, then it requires different skills, different approaches. And so if I think about my career, so I went frontline employment advisor. After a year, I became a manager. And in that first management role, I was managing a team of 7 people originally, and that grew to about a team of 30. My next step then was I became a director, and all of a sudden I went from managing 30 people to managing 200. Managing 200 people, if I worked in the same way, I would have failed because I couldn't have an individual personal relationship with 200 people. I had to actually manage my managers rather than manage my team directly. That took different skills. It required some of the same skills, but also I had to develop new skills. I would say when you're looking at getting promoted, you need to have that understanding. Often you'll succeed because you're really strong at something. People should play to their strengths. I'm definitely a big advocate. Play to your strengths, take a strength-based approach. However, as you develop in your career, if you become too reliant on particular strengths and you just do the same thing over and over, actually it can turn into a weakness.
Tip 6 is run towards problems, not away from them.
Out of all of them, this is probably my favorite, and I think this really comes into play if you want to do the most senior roles. The person that gave me this advice was a guy called Alistair James. So I still work with Alistair today. He's an ex-Deloitte partner. So he set up their operational excellence practice. He now runs his own company and he works with me in mine. But this was probably about 12, 13 years ago. I was working with Alistair and he gave me this advice. In essence, when you're in business, things always go wrong. Guaranteed, okay? You're gonna face challenges, mistakes happen, plans don't come to fruition, or you have a plan, it doesn't work out, you miss targets, whatever it is. The economy goes bust, things like COVID happen, Brexit happens, you name it. Things are gonna go wrong that mess up your plans. The more senior you get, the more pressure potentially could sit on your shoulders because you are responsible for a team, you could be responsible for a department, you could be responsible for a whole company, hundreds of people, if not thousands of people's jobs that can rely on you. And so I don't know what's going to go wrong. When I work with leaders, I say this, but I can guarantee something's going to go wrong. You need to be able to cope with it. And the way you cope with it is don't run away from problems, run towards them. Let me explain this. When something bad is about to happen or you see something bad happening, the natural reflex is to run away. What happens in business is you can't run away from the problems. In the act of running away, you give up control. So you're not in control. If something's happening, doesn't matter how bad it is, if you're fearful and you're trying to avoid it, you give up control. If you run towards the problem, you take control. Running towards the problem means figuring out, actually, right, there's a big problem on the horizon, I'm going to run towards it, I'm going to have to tackle it head on. And so it teaches you a few things. It teaches you how to problem solve, and that's incredibly important because, again, nothing ever really goes to plan. That's the secret. It's all about how you adapt. But it also teaches you perspective. And perspective is really important because when things are going wrong and you're the boss and you're the leader, people look to you and they take their cues from how you behave. So if you panic, then people in the organization panic and it starts to flow down. And I've seen this happen. Whereas if you are calm, and as somebody who's been a CEO and been in charge of businesses, I've had to deal with some quite scary moments. I mean, one business I was in, we went from being super profitable to losing £1 million in a single month. And and we'd never experienced that. That was a huge issue for us. But what we did is we took control of it and we ran towards the problem and we solved it.
Final tip, tip 7, is all about never stop learning and developing.
This is a really obvious one and people will talk about this. I could maybe term it in a slightly different way, which is be restless. Be restless and don't stand still and don't stagnate. I refer to that first company that I worked for, Age 25. So I was there for 10 years, but actually in those 10 years, I did 7 jobs. Although it was just one organization, what I found is every time I had mastered a role, I started to get a bit restless and a new opportunity came and I took that opportunity. And that kind of happened. And then after 10 years and the last role I did there, Deputy CEO, I did it for 3.5 years. The length of time it took me to master each subsequent role got longer and longer. However, the moment I got to the point where I started to feel comfortable, that's when I knew I had to look for the new challenge. The way I sort of think about it is you hit peak performance when you're at the limit of your capabilities. If you actually then stay doing something that you know how to do often your performance will actually dip a little bit and go off the other side. And I see this with people who feel they get to a position in an organization, they start to stagnate. And actually, the longer they stay at that position, the worse they become at their job. And I think it's because they've got stuck. Whereas I think a much better thing to do is you get to a point where you feel like you've mastered your role. If there's an opportunity internally, great, go for it. But if not, look for the next thing, because that's going to keep you pushing yourself forward, keep developing you, keep stretching you. And in the long run, that's going to be much better for your career.
Thank you, Chris, so much
That's
for all
okay.
this. I've taken lots of notes. I may kind of publish a bit of a blog as well as a guidance. I think you and I talked about doing more of these videos as well in the
Yes.
future. So
Yeah.
what I would like to learn a bit more about, how do you pitch yourself at the right level? How do you prepare for these interviews and presentations? How do you form a view and opinion? Feedback that often I get is around strategic, operational.
Yeah.
So that's the gap. I think it's quite useful for any level, really, especially when you're changing roles, whether it's changing roles from one industry to another industry or from within. That's the bit I think that's quite missing, and it would be good to do a video about that as well.
Yeah, I'd love to do a video. And we talked. So I've got a very specific approach for interviews.
Yeah.
So I call it, treat each interview like an election.
So we'll talk about
So that could
this
be a
a
good
bit
one.
more. It's a great video idea. We hope you enjoyed this freestyle video. Again, this was not scripted. It was just a quick coffee conversation on 7 tips. You can find Chris on LinkedIn. He's also on YouTube. And if you have any questions, please get in contact. We would happily answer any questions you have. And see you in the next video.
Thank you. Thank
Bye
you,
for
Sanya.
now. Bye.